A new beginning. The city of Los Angeles stretched out before Joseph like a vast and intricate puzzle, a sprawling labyrinth of dreams and aspirations, where lives intersected and fortunes were made. From his modest one-bedroom apartment, perched atop a hill, he could see the glimmering skyline, the twinkling lights of the city whispering stories of ambition, success, and failure. The rhythm of the city, its hustle, its energy, felt both distant and intimately close, like the heartbeat of the world. It was a place where stories were born and broken, where the paths of the lucky and the unlucky were laid bare for all to see. Joseph had once been part of that unspoken world, the invisible, overlooked, and forgotten. His story had started as one of struggle, surviving from day to day, clinging to the remnants of hope that were often smothered by the harsh realities of life on the streets. Homelessness had been his label, an identity he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. It wasn't that he hadn't tried to escape it. He had. He had worked odd jobs, hustled in every way he could, but something always seemed to go wrong. Each setback pushed him deeper into despair until there was nothing left but the cold pavement, the aching hunger, and the quiet despair of watching others pass by, with no one ever seeing him. But that had changed. Now, as he looked out over the city, something had shifted within him. No longer did he see a place full of barriers, rejection, and judgment. Instead, he saw a land of infinite potential, a canvas, waiting to be painted with the colors of new beginnings. His perspective had altered, and it was more than just a change in mindset. It was as though he had taken a step out of the darkness and into the light. He could feel the promise of something more, a life beyond mere survival. In the weeks since that fateful day when he had stood face to face with Thomas Hargrave, a wealthy businessman whose careless words had shamed him in front of the world, Joseph had begun to rebuild. It wasn't easy. It required every ounce of his willpower to put one foot in front of the other, to rise each day with the determination that today would be better than yesterday. But with every passing day, the cracks in his confidence slowly healed. The job training programs, the small wins, the steps forward, no matter how tiny they seemed, these were victories he had never known before. He felt himself becoming more and more capable, more resilient, and more like the man he had once dreamed of being. But it wasn't just his efforts that had pushed him forward. The kindness of others had been a guiding light when he had lost all hope. The shelter that had initially felt like a cold, impersonal refuge had transformed into something more, a home. It was a place where he could rest and rebuild, where the pain of his past could be confronted and over time healed. The counselors at the shelter, the fellow residents who had shared their stories, the volunteers who offered their time and their hearts. It was all part of a larger network of support that helped him realize that he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one struggling, and he wasn't the only one trying to rebuild. Joseph thought often of Keanu Reeves, the actor who had taken a chance on him in a moment of vulnerability, had shown him a level of kindness and empathy that Joseph had not experienced in years. It wasn't just about the money or the lunch they had shared. It was about the words Keanu had said that day, words that had stayed with him. It's about living. Keep going. Those words had become Joseph's mantra, a constant reminder that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about truly living, about finding joy in the small moments, about taking control of his destiny, about building a life of meaning and purpose. Joseph had repeated those words to himself every day. When doubt crept in, when he felt like giving up, he would whisper them under his breath like a prayer. It's about living. Keep going. And keep going he did. As the weeks turned into months, Joseph's resolve only strengthened. He was attending job interviews, taking on new challenges, and most importantly, finding his voice again. The weight of his past was still there, but it no longer defined him. He had learned that his worth wasn't determined by his circumstances, but by his actions, by the way he treated others, and by the effort he put into creating a better future. Through it all, he couldn't help but notice how the world around him was changing. It wasn't just him. It was the city, too. There was a shift in the air, an undercurrent of change that seemed to echo the path he was on. It had started small, just a whisper at first, but soon the conversations about homelessness, about wealth inequality, about systemic injustice, began to gain momentum. His confrontation with Thomas Hargrave, a moment of public humiliation that had once threatened to break him, had somehow become a catalyst for something much larger. The media had latched onto his story, dubbing him the homeless man who became the face of change. His experience had sparked discussions, public debates, and a growing movement dedicated to addressing the inequalities in society. Homelessness was no longer just a problem to be ignored. People were talking about it. People were acting. More organizations were joining the fight, working together to provide sustainable solutions to homelessness, to give people like Joseph a chance at rebuilding their lives. It was a powerful reminder that one small act of kindness, one moment of human connection, could ripple outward and create a tidal wave of change. Joseph's own transformation was a part of that larger shift. He could see it in the people he met, in the way his community had rallied around him. The shelter where he had first arrived, disheveled and lost, had become a place of growth and mentorship. The counselors there had guided him, not just as a resident, but as a person with value, with potential. The volunteers, too, had shown him that no act of kindness was too small, that even a few minutes of someone's time could make a world of difference. But there was still more to be done. Joseph's work wasn't finished. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people he could help, the lives he could touch. As the city grew and changed, so did he. The fight wasn't over. There were still too many who had not yet found their way out, too many who still struggled, who still felt invisible. The momentum had started, but now it needed to be nurtured, fed, and grown. One morning, as Joseph sat in his apartment looking out over the city, his phone buzzed with an unexpected message. The message was from none other than Thomas Hargrave, the very man who had once humiliated him. "Joseph, I've been thinking a lot about the work we've been doing together. I think we can do more. I'd like to meet and discuss a new initiative I'm working on. I think we could really make a difference." Joseph read the message twice, his heart beating a little faster. A part of him wanted to ignore it. After all, Thomas had been a symbol of the very system that had caused him so much pain. But as he sat there, something deep inside told him that this might be an opportunity for something bigger, for something that could reach beyond his personal struggles and touch the lives of others. He hesitated for only a moment before responding. "I'll meet you." And so, the next chapter of his journey began, one that would take him even deeper into the world he had once believed was closed off to him. But this time, he would be stepping into it as an equal, not as a beggar, but as a man who had something to offer. The invitation. The sun had barely risen over the city of Los Angeles when Joseph received the message. The quiet of the early morning was broken only by the occasional honk of a passing car or the distant hum of a far-off plane, a stark contrast to the buzzing chaos of the city below. He had just finished his morning routine, a simple but grounding ritual that helped him start the day with intention. Brewing a pot of coffee, reading a few pages from a book that spoke to his soul, and writing down his thoughts in a journal. These moments of stillness had become sacred, grounding him in a way that nothing else could. When his phone buzzed with the notification, his heart skipped a beat. It was from Thomas Hargrave, a name Joseph hadn't expected to hear from again, but one that had been lingering in the back of his mind ever since their public confrontation. He had come to realize that their interaction had been a turning point for both of them. For Joseph, it had forced him to look within, to challenge the narrative he had lived with for so long, the narrative of being a homeless man, a forgotten soul in a city of million-dollar dreams. For Thomas, it seemed, the experience had done something similar. The once arrogant businessman had seemingly vanished in the aftermath, replaced by someone who had begun to reflect on his own actions and choices. "Joseph, I've been thinking a lot about the work we've been doing together," the message began. "I think we can do more. I'd like to meet and discuss a new initiative I'm working on. I think we could really make a difference." Joseph stared at the screen, his mind whirring with questions. What did Thomas want? Was this a genuine offer to make amends? Or was it another attempt to save face in the public eye? He had seen people like Thomas before, people who wanted to appear as if they were changing, but only for the sake of their image, their reputation. Was this another one of those moments, or had Thomas truly learned something from their interaction? The temptation to dismiss the message was strong. Joseph had learned the hard way to guard his trust carefully. He had been let down too many times by people who promised change only to revert to their old ways once the cameras were off or the spotlight faded. But there was something in Thomas's words that felt different this time. It wasn't about grand gestures or the promise of publicity. It was about action. It was about doing something tangible, something that could help others, something that could make a real impact. Joseph put the phone down for a moment, taking a deep breath. His mind wandered back to the conversation he had had with Keanu months ago. The actor had been right. It wasn't about surviving. It was about living, about taking opportunities, even when the fear of failure loomed large. And this, he realized, was an opportunity to make a difference, to shape something larger than himself. He typed a quick response. "I'll meet you." And with that, the next chapter of his journey began. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew he couldn't turn back. He had come too far. The path ahead wasn't clear, but Joseph was determined to walk it. The meeting was set for a few days later, at a cafe near Joseph's apartment. It was a small, intimate space, the kind of place where the noise of the world seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the warmth of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with novels, poetry, and biographies, each with a story to tell. It was the perfect setting for a conversation that could change the course of both their lives. Joseph arrived early, giving him time to collect his thoughts. As he sat at a corner table, sipping on his coffee, he couldn't help but wonder how this meeting would unfold. Would it be a conversation about their shared past, their confrontation, the way the world had watched their lives intertwine? Or would it be about something else entirely? He knew that whatever it was, it would have a profound impact. This was more than just a meeting. It was an invitation to help shape the future of something much larger than himself. As he watched the door open and Thomas stepped inside, Joseph couldn't help but notice the change in him. Gone was the sharp, arrogant businessman who had first crossed his path. Instead, Thomas appeared more subdued, his eyes tired but focused, his suit less pristine, as if he had shed the layers of armor that once defined him. There was a vulnerability about him now, something raw and honest that hadn't been there before. Thomas spotted Joseph immediately and made his way over, his expression cautious but sincere. There was no fanfare, no flashy gestures, just a man who had come to make things right. "Joseph," Thomas greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thanks for agreeing to meet. I know I haven't exactly been someone you'd want to sit down with, but I hope we can work together to do something meaningful." Joseph nodded, studying him for a moment. There was no denying the change in Thomas, but Joseph couldn't help but feel a flicker of skepticism. How much of this was driven by genuine remorse, and how much was it the result of public pressure? He couldn't yet say, but the look in Thomas's eyes told him that whatever the motivation, something inside him had shifted. "Let's hear it," Joseph said, his tone calm but direct. He wasn't here to play games, and he wasn't interested in empty promises. If Thomas was serious, he would prove it with action. Thomas sat down, folding his hands on the table. "I've been meeting with some of the most respected voices in the homeless advocacy community," he began. "And after everything that happened, I realized that providing temporary solutions, shelter, food, emergency help, just isn't enough. What's needed is something more sustainable, something that addresses the root causes of homelessness and provides long-term pathways out." Joseph listened carefully. This wasn't the same Thomas he had once known. The man who had seen homelessness as a problem to be ignored, a thing to be dealt with only in passing. This was someone who had seen the cracks in the system, someone who was willing to take responsibility for his part in perpetuating it. "I want to propose an initiative," Thomas continued, "one that focuses on long-term solutions. We need to provide education, job training, mental health support, and stable housing. And we need to empower people who've experienced homelessness to take leadership roles in these programs. I want you to help me shape this project, Joseph. You've been there. You know what works and what doesn't. Your voice is vital to making this work." Joseph sat back in his chair, his mind racing. It was a bold proposal, one that aligned with everything he had learned in the past few months. The idea of not just offering temporary relief, but creating a system that helped people build sustainable futures was exactly what was needed. He had seen firsthand how the right support, combined with opportunity and empowerment, could change lives. "I'll help," Joseph said, his voice steady. "But only if we do this right. We need to involve people who've been through it. People like me. People who understand the struggles. And we need to make sure this is about dignity, not charity. It's not enough to give someone a bed for the night and call it a solution." Thomas nodded vigorously. "I agree. This can't be just another charity project. It needs to be a movement, one that's built by the people who understand it the most. Together, we can make it happen." As they spoke, a sense of possibility began to grow between them, a new kind of partnership born from the wreckage of their past. For the first time, Joseph felt like he was not just part of a solution, but part of a movement. He wasn't just a recipient of help anymore. He was a catalyst, a leader in his own right. The future was uncertain, and there were still many hurdles ahead. But in this moment, as the conversation unfolded before him, Joseph realized that he was no longer just surviving. He was living. And the journey he had begun, together with Thomas, with Keanu's words still echoing in his heart, was about to change everything. A partnership forged in the fire of change. The week after his meeting with Thomas Hargrave felt like a whirlwind for Joseph. What had started as a tentative conversation between two men from vastly different worlds had quickly morphed into a partnership with the potential to change the very fabric of homelessness advocacy in Los Angeles. Joseph felt the weight of the task ahead, the gravity of the opportunity he had agreed to, but more than that, he felt a rising sense of hope. It was the kind of hope that only came from taking a step into the unknown, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, but that it could lead somewhere extraordinary. Joseph's mind was abuzz as he prepared for their first official meeting. He had gone over the details of their proposal countless times in his head, refining his thoughts, asking himself questions about what was missing, what could be improved. He had learned over the years that the only way to make lasting change was to start with the people who were directly impacted. Everything had to be done in a way that respected their dignity, their humanity, and their right to a better life. He had no interest in another program that provided temporary fixes or used people as mere statistics. No, this had to be different. This had to be real. Thomas had called him several times in the past week, discussing logistics and possible partnerships with local shelters, community groups, and even private donors. There was a growing sense of urgency between them. The city, for all its glitz and glamour, had its problems. Homelessness was rampant, and the public's awareness of it had risen to new heights thanks to Joseph's viral story. But awareness alone wasn't enough. Action was needed, and fast. The morning of the meeting, Joseph was up early, reviewing the notes he had prepared. His mind was sharp, focused, ready to engage in a conversation that could lay the foundation for something monumental. As he gathered his things and headed out the door, his heart raced with anticipation. He wasn't just showing up as a former homeless man. He was showing up as a voice for thousands, a man with lived experience who could now influence the decisions being made for those still trapped in the cycle of poverty. The meeting took place in an office space located just outside downtown Los Angeles, a sleek, modern building that mirrored the cold, impersonal nature of much of the corporate world. Inside, Thomas was waiting. He greeted Joseph with a handshake that felt solid and genuine, the kind of handshake that spoke of mutual respect. "Joseph, I'm glad you could make it," Thomas said, his voice calm but full of determination. "I've been putting together a team. We're ready to get started, but I need to know you're on board with this. I need you to believe in this, because your voice will be the driving force behind it." Joseph nodded, settling into a chair across from Thomas. The room was minimalist, furnished with sleek wooden tables, glass walls, and large windows that overlooked the city. It was a beautiful view, but Joseph's focus was entirely on the man sitting before him, the man who had once been his adversary, now his partner in this grand endeavor. "I'm on board," Joseph said, his voice steady. "But I need to make one thing clear. This can't be another charity project. We need to make sure we're creating real, sustainable solutions. We need education programs, job training, mental health resources. We need housing, yes, but we also need long-term support. If we just give people a place to sleep, we're not solving the problem. We're just delaying it." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I agree. I want this to be more than just a shelter or a handout. I want this to be about empowerment, about giving people the tools they need to create their own futures. You've been in the trenches, Joseph. You know what works and what doesn't. You tell me what we need, and we'll make it happen." Joseph's eyes searched Thomas's face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but all he saw was determination. It was the kind of sincerity that made Joseph trust him more than he had expected. He hadn't forgotten the man's past. He never would. But he could see that Thomas was committed, truly committed to making a difference, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone and confronting his own demons. "I've been thinking about this," Joseph began. "The key to breaking the cycle of homelessness isn't just about giving people a roof over their heads. It's about giving them a reason to believe in themselves again. It's about restoring dignity. I can't tell you how many people I've met who have lost hope, who don't even know where to start. We need a holistic approach, a safe place to live, yes, but also access to education, therapy, job placement services. And we need to treat people like they're capable of change, not like they're charity cases." Thomas nodded, his fingers tapping on the table as he absorbed Joseph's words. "I get it," he said quietly. "I've been meeting with experts in all those fields. We've got counselors, social workers, housing experts, and job training organizations lined up. But we need someone to bring it all together. Someone who can speak the truth, who knows what it's like to live through this, and who can make sure we're staying on track. Someone who knows how to cut through the red tape." Joseph felt a sense of responsibility settle over him, the weight of the task ahead. He had always known that the fight to end homelessness would require more than just passion. It would take strategy, time, and most importantly, the collaboration of everyone involved. He had spent years fighting for a better life, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been forced to live in the shadows of society. And now he was being asked to take the lead, to ensure that the work they were doing didn't just feel good in theory, but that it was effective in practice. "I'll help," Joseph said, his voice firm. "But we need to build a system that empowers people, not just shelters them. We can't just create temporary solutions. We need sustainable programs that give people a sense of purpose, that offer them a real path to independence." The meeting lasted for hours as they discussed the details of the initiative. Together, they mapped out a strategy that would not only address the immediate needs of the homeless population, but also provide long-term support. It was a daunting task, but as the conversation continued, Joseph felt something stirring inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Later that day, as Joseph walked back to his apartment, his mind was still processing everything that had been discussed. He knew there was much work to be done. The scale of what they were trying to accomplish was immense, and the challenges ahead were far from easy. But for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he wasn't just another person struggling to survive. He was part of something larger than himself, part of a movement that could truly change the system that had failed so many. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Joseph took a deep breath, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. The road ahead would be long, but he was no longer walking it alone. With Thomas by his side, with Keanu's words in his heart, and with the collective effort of everyone involved, Joseph knew that they could make a difference. They could help create a new kind of future, one where no one was left behind. The partnership was forged in the fire of their shared vision, and it would burn brightly, lighting the way for those who needed it most. And Joseph, who had once been invisible, was now a beacon of hope for thousands of others who were waiting for their own chance at a new beginning. Building bridges. The days after their initial meeting felt like a blur to Joseph. He and Thomas had gone to work immediately, gathering resources, reaching out to contacts, and establishing a network of organizations and experts who could help bring their vision to life. What had once seemed like an impossible task, creating a sustainable initiative that would change the lives of homeless individuals, was quickly gaining momentum. As they worked together, the magnitude of what they were attempting to accomplish began to take shape, and Joseph felt both an overwhelming sense of purpose and a creeping feeling of anxiety. This was it. This was the moment he had been preparing for. There was no turning back now. The initiative, which they had decided to name Bridges to a New Tomorrow, was a bold and comprehensive plan. It wasn't just about providing a temporary solution or a handout. It was about providing the homeless with a chance at self-sufficiency, a way to reintegrate into society with the resources and support they needed. It would include housing, education, job training, and mental health services. But the most crucial aspect of the initiative was its holistic approach. This wasn't just a program. It was a bridge, an actual, tangible connection between the struggles of today and the hope of tomorrow. Joseph had spent years as part of the system that had failed him, and now he was going to be part of the team that built something new, something that could actually work. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his destiny. He wasn't just reacting to the world around him. He was creating a path forward. But as they worked through the details, Joseph quickly realized that building something this ambitious wasn't going to be easy. There were countless roadblocks ahead: funding, red tape, resistance from both public and private sectors, and most daunting of all, the question of how to change public perception of homelessness. Joseph knew better than anyone that the stigma surrounding homelessness ran deep. People saw homeless individuals as faceless, nameless problems to be solved, not as human beings with stories, dreams, and potential. Changing that perception, Joseph understood, would take time, patience, and a concerted effort to reframe the narrative. It wasn't long before Joseph found himself at the forefront of the campaign to change public perception. Thomas had connected him with several influential media outlets, and his story, the story of a homeless man who had turned his life around and was now leading a movement for change, was beginning to capture the attention of the public. His interviews were candid and raw, sharing the reality of homelessness with a level of honesty that resonated deeply with viewers. He didn't sugarcoat his struggles. He didn't pretend it was easy. He spoke about the pain, the hopelessness, and the small victories that had kept him going. But he also spoke about the system's failures and the potential for change. Keanu's words echoed in his mind as he sat in front of the cameras. It's about living. Keep going. Each interview, each conversation, became an opportunity to dismantle the myths surrounding homelessness. It wasn't about lazy people who refused to work or drug addicts who had chosen their fate. It was about systemic failures, about a society that had failed to address the root causes of homelessness, such as mental illness, addiction, and economic disparity. It was about providing people with the tools and resources to rebuild their lives, not just a bed for the night. At the same time, Joseph worked with Thomas and their team to create an actual framework for the initiative. They began reaching out to local shelters, connecting with job training programs, and building relationships with educational institutions that could offer classes and workshops for homeless individuals. It was clear that the need for bridges to a new tomorrow was greater than they had anticipated. The city was brimming with people who were living on the margins, those who had lost everything and had nowhere to turn. Joseph couldn't ignore the faces of those he had seen in the shelters, the ones who had given up hope, who had been forgotten by society. He was determined that their story wouldn't end in obscurity. They deserved more. One evening, as Joseph sat in the small office that had become the command center for their initiative, he received an unexpected call. It was Keanu. Joseph had kept in touch with him over the past few months, updating him on the progress of the project. Keanu had been a silent partner in all of this, offering advice and encouragement when needed, but Joseph had never expected him to get involved in a formal way. "Joseph," Keanu's voice came through the phone with its usual calm, steady tone. "I've been following everything closely. I've been thinking, this is big. It's going to change lives. But I think there's something more I can do to help." Joseph felt a rush of gratitude. Keanu had already helped so much. His words had been a guiding light, and his initial generosity had set everything in motion. But Keanu wanted to take things further. "What do you have in mind?" Joseph asked, curious but cautious. "I've been in touch with some people," Keanu said, "and I'd like to put together a benefit concert, something to raise awareness and funds for bridges to a new tomorrow. We could get some musicians, some celebrities involved. I'm sure we can make it a huge event. What do you think?" Joseph's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly what they needed, a way to bring attention to the initiative and raise the funds necessary to make it sustainable. A benefit concert, backed by Keanu's influence and the support of the entertainment industry, could provide the visibility they needed. But more than that, it could help change the way the public viewed homelessness. "I think it's brilliant," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. "If we can get people to care, if we can get them to see what's really going on, we'll be unstoppable." And so, the plans for the concert were set in motion. Keanu's connections with the music and film industries allowed them to secure high-profile performers, sponsors, and a venue that would hold thousands. The event, which they named Bridges to the Future, would not only raise much-needed funds, but also become a platform for sharing stories of resilience, of hope, and of transformation. The concert would feature testimonials from individuals who had been through the Bridges to a New Tomorrow program, their voices becoming a testament to the power of community, support, and second chances. As the concert date neared, Joseph found himself overwhelmed by the scale of what they were building. The initiative had gained national attention, and the media buzz surrounding the event was growing by the day. The campaign was already making waves, but it was the concert that would take it to the next level. It would not only provide the resources needed to keep the program running, but also show the world that homelessness wasn't a problem that could be ignored any longer. Days turned into weeks, and the excitement around Bridges to the Future continued to grow. Joseph worked tirelessly alongside Thomas and the rest of the team, coordinating the logistics of the event, while also continuing to push forward on the ground-level work of the initiative. They were still building bridges, one connection at a time, but with each day, it became more apparent that they were on the verge of something monumental. And then, the night of the concert arrived. Joseph stood backstage, watching as the venue filled with people, some who had come to support the cause, others who had simply come for a night of entertainment. But regardless of their initial motivations, they would all leave that night with a new understanding of what it meant to live on the streets, what it meant to lose everything, and most importantly, what it meant to rebuild. The stories that would be shared, the voices that would be heard, this was the turning point. The world was about to see homelessness through a different lens, and Joseph was determined that no one would leave that night without a renewed sense of hope. As the lights dimmed and the music began, Joseph closed his eyes for a moment, letting the energy of the crowd wash over him. This was only the beginning. The bridges they had built, the partnerships they had forged, were not just the foundation of a new initiative. They were the first steps toward a new world, one where every person had the chance to rebuild, to live, to thrive. This wasn't just about helping a few individuals. This was about changing the system, changing the way people saw those who had been forgotten. Joseph was no longer just a survivor of homelessness. He was a leader, a catalyst for change, and with every passing moment, that change was growing stronger. The future was brighter, and Bridges to a New Tomorrow was the bridge that would carry them all toward it. The struggle and the rise. As the weeks after Bridges to the Future passed, Joseph found himself grappling with the mounting pressures of a vision that had grown larger than he could have ever anticipated. What had begun as a heartfelt attempt to help those in need had exploded into a nationwide movement, drawing attention, resources, and voices from all walks of life. The benefit concert had not only raised millions of dollars, but had also set off a wave of support from people who had once been indifferent to the plight of the homeless. Yet, as much as Joseph wanted to revel in the success of the concert, there was no time for rest. He knew that the real work had only just begun. The funds raised were essential, but they were only a piece of the puzzle. What mattered now was how they used that money, how they structured their programs, and how they made sure that the impact would be both deep and lasting. He spent long hours with Thomas, going over plans, fine-tuning strategies, and meeting with potential partners. They had started assembling a team of experts in various fields: social workers, mental health professionals, educators, job placement specialists. But there was always something more to be done. The scale of the task ahead was overwhelming, and sometimes Joseph felt the weight of it pressing down on him, threatening to crush the resolve he had worked so hard to build. But even in the midst of the pressure, there was a fire inside him, a fire that refused to go out. The journey that had begun in the streets of Los Angeles had turned into something much more significant than just his personal transformation. He was now part of a larger movement, one that would challenge the very systems that had perpetuated the cycle of poverty and homelessness for generations. In the early days of the initiative's launch, things seemed to move at lightning speed. They quickly established a framework for their housing programs. They began identifying vacant properties in the city that could be transformed into long-term housing solutions for the homeless. These spaces weren't going to be temporary shelters or dormitory-style rooms. They were going to be homes. Each one would be fully furnished, with individual rooms that offered privacy and dignity, spaces where people could heal, reflect, and rebuild their lives. These homes would come with access to on-site counselors, job coaches, and even social events designed to reintegrate participants into the wider community. The response from the community was largely positive, but Joseph soon realized that the true struggle lay not in the implementation of the programs, but in the deep-rooted systemic challenges that had plagued the homeless population for decades. It wasn't enough to simply house people. There were deeper issues at play: untreated mental health conditions, addiction, trauma, and a history of disenfranchisement. These were issues that couldn't be solved with a roof over someone's head. They needed to be confronted head-on. Joseph and his team worked tirelessly to provide the necessary resources for these challenges. They established partnerships with local mental health clinics, drug rehabilitation programs, and vocational training centers. They even worked on building relationships with businesses in the city to create opportunities for people to re-enter the workforce. However, the hardest part was navigating the bureaucracy that came with trying to enact lasting change. Local governments, corporate interests, and even some well-meaning organizations often slowed progress, bogged down by red tape, competing priorities, and political agendas. Joseph had come to expect resistance, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. He remembered the cynicism he had once harbored for society, the same cynicism that had kept him on the streets for so long. It was hard to fight that fight when the very systems he was trying to change were often the ones that held the keys to progress. One particularly difficult afternoon, Joseph sat alone in his office, his mind racing with the challenges they were facing. He had just come from a meeting with a local government official who had expressed doubts about the sustainability of the Bridges to a New Tomorrow initiative. Despite the success of the concert and the attention they had garnered, there were still people who didn't believe that a long-term solution to homelessness was possible. They saw the problem as insurmountable, too complex to solve. They believed that homelessness was a fixture of society, something that couldn't be eliminated. Joseph clenched his fists, frustration building inside him. It was one thing to face opposition from those who didn't understand, but to face it from people who held the power to help, who could make the changes happen, was a different kind of blow. The skepticism of politicians, the reluctance of big businesses to get involved, and the fear that many shared about the potential costs of such a large-scale initiative, all of it threatened to undo the progress they had made. But then Joseph remembered the faces of the people he had met in the shelters. He thought about the conversations he had had with men and women who had lost everything, people who had been through hell and back, and yet still had hope. The power of human resilience, the willingness to fight for a better life, was not something that could be easily extinguished. These were people who deserved a chance, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from them. He stood up, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. There was still work to be done, but he was no longer the man who had been broken by his circumstances. He was a man with a mission, someone who had witnessed firsthand the transformative power of support and opportunity. He wasn't going to back down now. Over the next few months, the Bridges to a New Tomorrow initiative continued to gain traction. The funding from the concert had been allocated carefully, ensuring that every dollar was being put to good use. The first few housing units had opened their doors, and Joseph visited each one, meeting the new residents, hearing their stories, and witnessing the joy in their eyes as they began to rebuild their lives. There was nothing quite like seeing someone move from the streets into a space they could call their own. The pride they felt in having a place to belong, the sense of dignity they regained, was indescribable. But for every success, there were still struggles. There were setbacks, people who had relapsed into addiction, people who had fallen into old habits, people who found it difficult to trust again. Joseph understood this. He knew that the journey to recovery was never linear. It was filled with ups and downs, moments of triumph and moments of despair, but every step forward was a victory. And the more people they helped, the more they were proving that change was possible. One night, after visiting a new housing complex in the heart of the city, Joseph found himself standing outside, looking up at the starry sky. The city around him seemed to pulse with energy, the lights flickering like stars in a galaxy of dreams and possibilities. As he breathed in the cool night air, he thought back to the dark days when he had first walked these streets, lost, hopeless, and invisible. Now, as he stood at the helm of a movement that was changing lives, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was the reason I fought, he thought to himself. For this moment, for this chance to make a difference, to show the world that no one is truly beyond redemption. The road ahead was long, but Joseph no longer saw it as a struggle against insurmountable odds. He saw it as a path filled with possibility. He knew there would be more resistance, more challenges, more doubts. But he was no longer just a survivor. He was a leader. And with every step he took, the bridge to a new tomorrow grew stronger, one person at a time. The ripple effect. The momentum behind Bridges to a New Tomorrow continued to surge forward, and with each new success came the realization that this was bigger than any one individual or initiative. The lives Joseph had touched, the community that had come together to fight for systemic change, had created a ripple effect far beyond the city of Los Angeles. Their efforts were beginning to change the national conversation about homelessness, shifting from a narrative of hopelessness to one of opportunity, from one of judgment to one of understanding. Joseph's role in the movement had transformed over time. He had gone from a man fighting for his own survival to a leader at the forefront of an effort that was reshaping the landscape of homelessness. But it wasn't just the progress in Los Angeles that had made the greatest impact. It was the shift in how people began to see homelessness, how they began to understand it not as a series of isolated individual failures, but as a complex, multifaceted issue that required collective effort and compassion. People had started to question their assumptions, to dig deeper into the root causes, and to ask themselves what role they could play in ending the cycle of poverty. Joseph had spoken at conferences, appeared on national news programs, and met with leaders from all over the country who were eager to replicate the success of Bridges to a New Tomorrow in their own cities. Everywhere he went, he was met with a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and hope. People wanted to know how it was possible for a former homeless man to lead an initiative that was tackling such a pervasive problem. And Joseph had no easy answers. The truth was that it had taken years of hardship, of self-reflection, and of finding the strength to believe that a better life was possible, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been cast aside by society. But what Joseph didn't say was that it wasn't just about him anymore. His story had become a symbol, a representation of the power of second chances, of the profound difference that a single act of kindness could make. And that power had spread, touching the hearts of millions. One afternoon, Joseph found himself at a roundtable meeting in Washington, D.C., sitting with policymakers, philanthropists, and community leaders. The room was filled with energy, everyone talking over one another as they debated the next steps in expanding the reach of their initiative. There were passionate voices on all sides, each person eager to contribute their thoughts on how to address homelessness. But it wasn't just the policy discussions that held Joseph's attention, it was the people. Around the table sat individuals who had once been homeless themselves, people who had lived through the struggles he knew so well, struggles that had kept them trapped in a cycle of despair and isolation. Some had risen from those depths to become advocates, organizers, and leaders in their communities. Others were still in the midst of rebuilding, still facing the challenges of integrating back into society. But as Joseph listened to their stories, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. These were the voices that mattered, the voices of those who had been on the streets, who had lived through the trauma, and who understood the real solutions. As the conversation moved forward, Joseph's mind wandered to the countless individuals who had benefited from the program, people who had regained not just their homes, but their confidence and their dignity. One man, a former addict named Richard, had entered the program just a year earlier. He had come from a background of abuse, struggled with addiction for years, and had spent the better part of a decade living on the streets of Los Angeles. But through Bridges to a New Tomorrow, Richard had turned his life around. He had completed a job training program, landed a stable job as a mechanic, and was now living in a modest apartment with his family. When Joseph had last spoken to him, Richard's eyes were full of pride as he spoke about his work, his goals for the future, and the dreams he had for his children. Richard was just one example of the ripple effect Bridges to a New Tomorrow had created. His story was now being shared in classrooms, on social media, and in community meetings across the country. And every time it was told, it inspired others to take action, to think differently about homelessness, and to get involved in their own communities. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, the impact of their efforts was becoming visible in more than just the numbers. The initiative had grown beyond the scope of what anyone had anticipated, and it had sparked a wider cultural shift in how homelessness was understood. More businesses were partnering with local shelters to provide jobs and internships for homeless individuals. Volunteers from all over the city showed up daily, eager to lend a hand. A new wave of compassion had taken root in the hearts of people, and the city, once known for its indifference to the marginalized, was becoming a beacon of hope and action. The public schools in Los Angeles had even begun integrating lessons on homelessness into their curriculums, teaching students about the causes of poverty, the importance of empathy, and how they could play an active role in creating a more equitable society. The next generation was being shaped not by the stigma of homelessness, but by a deep understanding of the need for compassion and action. These young people, inspired by the changes in their city, were growing up in a world that no longer saw homelessness as an insurmountable problem, but as something that could be addressed through community and systemic reform. But even as the ripple effect spread, Joseph knew the journey wasn't over. He was acutely aware of how fragile progress could be, how quickly the momentum could slip away if they weren't vigilant. There were still millions of people living on the streets, still far too many who didn't have access to the services, the care, and the opportunities they needed to rebuild their lives. And Joseph knew that not everyone would succeed in the program. Not everyone would be able to overcome the weight of their past, their trauma, and their struggles. But the success stories, the moments of triumph, and the lives that were changed were enough to keep him going. That evening, after a long day of meetings and press conferences, Joseph found himself walking along the streets of Los Angeles once more. He didn't take this walk for reflection or nostalgia. Instead, he did it to remind himself of the faces he had seen, the people he had met, the stories he had heard. He knew that each of those stories mattered, that the work they were doing was far from finished. As he walked, a man approached him, a familiar face. It was David, a former resident of one of the housing units who had struggled with addiction, but had recently graduated from the job training program. David had a broad smile on his face and an air of confidence that was contagious. He waved to Joseph. "Hey, Joseph, I just wanted to say thank you," David said, his voice warm with gratitude. "I've got a steady job now. I'm living in my own apartment. You gave me a chance when I thought there was none left. I'll never forget that." Joseph smiled, his heart swelling with pride. This was why he kept going. This was the reason behind the struggle, the sleepless nights, the endless meetings. For moments like this, for people like David. "No," Joseph replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You did this, David. You made the choice to keep going. I'm just here to help show the way." As they shook hands, Joseph realized that this was the ultimate ripple effect. It wasn't just about the programs, the funding, or the media coverage. It was about people taking control of their own lives, finding their strength, and helping others do the same. This was the change he had fought for. This was the legacy of bridges to a new tomorrow. The future was still uncertain, but the foundation had been laid. And Joseph knew that as long as people like David were out there, living proof that change was possible, the movement would continue to grow, to inspire, and to touch lives. The ripple was far from over. It was only just beginning.